In 2020, a journalist named Rich Cohen published an article in Tablet magazine that started with a simple observation. There are a lot of black people in America with the last name Cohen. Not just a few. A lot. NFL running back Tariq Cohen grew up in Bunn, North Carolina. Landon Cohen, another NFL player, came from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Neither was raised Jewish. Neither had any conscious connection to Judaism. But they both carried a surname that is, in Jewish tradition, the name of the priestly caste, the Kohanim, the direct descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Cohen traced the name back to a single origin. Around 1750, a Portuguese Jew named Moses Cohen sailed from London to Charleston, South Carolina, where he became one of the city's religious leaders. His sons moved to Georgetown, South Carolina, where they had relationships with black women, some enslaved, some free. Their children carried the Cohen name, and over the following 2 centuries, that name spread through black communities across the American South, carried by people who had no idea that their surname connected them to one of the oldest priestly lineages in human history. This is not an isolated story. It is a pattern. And the deeper you look into it, the more you find that Jewish DNA has traveled through black American communities in ways that almost nobody is talking about. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. The first and most direct pathway is colonial intermarriage and coerced relationships. Jewish communities existed in the American colonies from the 1600s onward. The first permanent Jewish settlers in what is now the United States were 23 Sephardic Jews who arrived in New Amsterdam in 1654. In the centuries that followed, Jewish communities were established across the American South, particularly in cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. Some Jewish colonists owned enslaved people. This is a historical fact that the Jewish community has grappled with, and it means that sexual relationships between Jewish men and enslaved black women, some coerced, some consensual, produced children whose descendants carry Jewish DNA today. The scale is impossible to determine precisely, but it was not trivial. Charleston, South Carolina, had one of the largest Jewish communities in colonial America. Savannah, Georgia, had a Jewish community dating to 1733. These communities existed alongside large enslaved populations, and the mixing that occurred between them left genetic traces that are now being discovered through DNA testing. When black Americans in the South take ancestry tests and find unexpected European Jewish markers, the most likely explanation, in many cases, is a Jewish ancestor from the colonial or antebellum period. But the colonial pathway is only one part of the story. There are older and deeper connections between Jewish and African populations that predate the American experience entirely. The most extraordinary of these is the Lemba people of southern Africa. The Lemba are a Bantu-speaking people numbering roughly 70,000, living primarily in Zimbabwe and South Africa. For centuries, they maintained traditions that were strikingly different from their neighbors. They practiced circumcision, they avoided pork, they observed a day of rest, they had endogamy rules that prohibited marriage outside the group. They had an oral tradition claiming descent from Jews who left Israel and traveled to Africa through Yemen. And for centuries, nobody outside the Lemba community took these claims seriously. Then in the late 1990s, geneticists tested them. The results were stunning. Approximately 50% of Lemba Y chromosomes showed Semitic origin. And among the Buba, the priestly subclan of the Lemba who claimed direct descent from the Jewish priesthood, the Cohen modal haplotype, the genetic marker associated with the Jewish priestly lineage, appeared at a frequency comparable to Ashkenazi and Sephardi Kohanim. The Lemba's oral tradition was confirmed by their DNA. They carry the genetic signature of the Jewish priesthood in their Y chromosomes, 2,500 years after their ancestors left the Middle East. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. The Lemba are the most genetically documented case, but they are not the only African community claiming Jewish heritage. The Igbo Jews of Nigeria number in the tens of thousands and maintain Jewish practices that some scholars trace to contact with Jewish traders or migrants in antiquity. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia, as we covered in a previous video, practiced Judaism for over 2,000 years in complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. The Abayudaya of Uganda are a community that adopted Judaism in the early 20th century under the leadership of Seme Kakungulu, a military leader who read the Old Testament and decided his people should follow it. While the Abayudaya are converts rather than descendants, their story illustrates the enduring pull of Jewish identity across the African continent. For Black Americans specifically, the connections are multiple. The colonial pathway brought Jewish DNA into Black communities through direct mixing in the American South. The African pathway means that some Black Americans may carry ancient Semitic markers through lineages that predate the slave trade entirely, tracing back to communities like the Lemba or other African populations that had contact with Jewish traders and settlers in antiquity. And the modern pathway includes 20th century intermarriage between Jewish and Black Americans, which, while less common than intermarriage between Jews and other white Americans, has produced a growing population of people who identify with both communities. The cultural connections run even deeper than the genetic ones. During the Civil Rights Movement, Jewish and Black Americans forged one of the most consequential political alliances in American history. Rabbis marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, two Jewish civil rights workers, were murdered alongside James Chaney, a Black activist, in Mississippi in 1964. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the most prominent Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, marched at the front of the Selma to Montgomery March, and later said that he felt his legs were praying. The alliance was built on a shared understanding of persecution, diaspora, and the struggle for equal rights. But the relationship has also been complicated by real tensions. Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam have promoted the claim that Jews were disproportionately responsible for the slave trade, a claim that has been thoroughly debunked by historians. While individual Jews participated in the slave trade, they were a tiny minority of slave traders, and the institution was overwhelmingly controlled by Christian Europeans. The weaponization of this historical distortion has strained Black-Jewish relations for decades, and has made the legitimate genetic and cultural connections between the two communities harder to discuss openly. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. What does this mean for a Black American who discovers Jewish markers on a DNA test? The same thing it means for a Latino who discovers Sephardi markers, which we covered in a previous video. It means that somewhere in your family history, a line was crossed. A Jewish ancestor contributed their DNA to your lineage, whether through a colonial-era relationship in Charleston, through an ancient Semitic migration to Africa that predated the slave trade by millennia, or through a modern intermarriage that your family may or may not have discussed openly. It does not make you Jewish. Jewish identity, as we have discussed in multiple videos on this channel, is defined by religion, culture, community, and maternal descent, not by a percentage on a DNA test. But it does connect you to a history that is far more intertwined with your own than most people realize. Black and Jewish histories in America are not parallel stories that occasionally intersect. They are braided together, genetically, culturally, and politically, in ways that most people on both sides have barely begun to understand. The Black Cohens of South Carolina carry a name that connects them to the Jewish priesthood through a Portuguese Jew who sailed to Charleston in 1750. The Lemba of Southern Africa carry the Cohen modal haplotype through a migration that began in Yemen thousands of years ago. Black Americans who marched for civil rights alongside Jewish allies shared not just a cause, but in some cases, a genetic heritage that neither community fully understood. The history of Black and Jewish people in America is not two stories. It is one story with two narrators. And the DNA is finally revealing the chapters that neither narrator knew existed. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper, the next video on your screen is one you won't want to miss. I'll see you there.